We expect China to slow slightly as the years go by. That's because of a structural adjustment that China has to go through with moving away from external-driven growth to domestic-driven growth. We did revise China up by 0.2% for 2020 because of the improvement in the U.S.-China trade relations.
Thank you. I'm staying over here. The lady in the front, please. I think it's CNBC.
Sylvia Matter from CNBC. I would like to ask you about the risks that you mentioned. One of them is new trade tensions between the US and Europe. I was wondering what sort of probability do you assign to this scenario? And could you elaborate on the economic risks of new trade tensions between the US and Europe? Thank you.
So while we've had positive news with the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal, there's obviously a lot more that still needs to be done. We would hope that the world moves towards a more open and sustainable trading system. We would hope that there would be a more comprehensive deal between the U.S. and China as the months go by. But we are concerned about risks returning, however, on the trade front, both with respect to U.S. and China, but also with respect to the U.S. and European Union. And there are other countries in the world that are also using protectionist measures. So trade tensions and disruptions are something that we do put out there as an important risk.
Thank you. I'm going to take the second row gentleman with the hand up, blue sweater, Reuters. Thank you.
Balazs Karani from Reuters. Two quick questions. One is about car manufacturing. There seems to be signs that car consumption habits are changing. So even if the sector is rebounding, do you see a risk that traditional producers, particularly in Europe, will not benefit from this rebound? Second is about central banks and climate change, and whether you think central banks should, in fact, take a bigger role in fighting climate change. Isn't there a risk, if they do this, that this creates an impression that they are ever so powerful and they can solve any problem in the world, which is probably wrong? So wouldn't such a role actually mislead governments about the power of central banks?
With respect to the auto sector, 2019 was a year when we saw a shrinkage in the auto sector. Towards the end of 2019, and if you look at some high-frequency indicators now, you certainly see some signs of stabilization. That said, the auto sector is going through a transformation. There are shifts in preferences towards more greener cars, electric vehicles. And so we can think of countries that rely on demand from, say, China, that might be affected because the demand has shifted more towards electric cars as opposed to the more traditional fuels. And then there's also changing preferences in terms of using the more shared economy, things of that kind. So this is a sector that is in transformation. I mean, although we have the signs of stabilization at pretty low levels at this point. As for central banking and climate change, I mean, we see an important role where central banks are involved, which is with regard to stress testing. And that has to take into account risks associated with climate. And that's an important role that central banks can play.
Thank you. ITV in the front row, please.
Hello there. You mentioned in the outlook the risk posed by climate change. I wonder, though, in the IMF's view, are governments acting urgently enough to tackle the threat posed by global warming?
Climate risk is near and present. There are huge changes that will be associated with the change we're seeing in the climate. One is, of course, that we would see a transformation, a structural transformation in the economy as you shift away from traditional industries to kind of more green industries. And that transformation has risks in terms of jobs, in terms of it requires reskilling. Secondly, of course, there are the risks that are associated with how to deal with climate change right now. There are small states that have, been affected severely by climate change. The question is how to adapt to that. So this is not something that countries can actually argue about. It is a major issue. they have to step up, and they should display all the political will that's needed to get the job done.
Thank you, Gita. I'm swinging around to the side of the room, and El País here, and the lady in the front. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Alicia González from El País. Two questions. You revised downward for Spain, your outlook for Spain, and I would like you to elaborate a bit on that. And you mentioned several times in the report the risks associated to social discontent and the need for inclusiveness. Does it mean the IMF recommends now get back from austerity and use the fiscal policy instead? Thank you.
So with regard to Spain, we had a small downward revision. Remember, Spain was coming from cyclical highs, and it slowed down a little more faster than we expected. I'll ask Gian Maria to go into that in more detail. Let me just briefly comment on social unrest. Social unrest picked up quite sharply in 2019. You saw that in many parts of the world. There was no one common explanation for why it was the case. There were different reasons in Chile versus in Hong Kong. These were completely different reasons. However, it is important to recognize that social spending is well targeted, that the vulnerable are actually protected, and countries need to make sure that the growth and the recovery that we're actually projecting is shared more equally.